From Wyoming's population of just over 500,000 to Idaho's density of 20 people per square mile, here's why nobody lives in these empty states. The United States is home to 300 million people, but the state of Wyoming contains just 570,000 of them. It's kind of weird that one of America's 50 states would have the population of a small city. There are hundreds of towns all around the world that seem jam-packed by comparison, and even Wyoming's own largest city has under 70,000 people living in it. That's about as many people as New York has in, 5 square miles. So what gives? Well, this state doesn't really have much going on. It has the Rocky Mountains on one side and some attractive yet desolate prairies on the other. Also, there just aren't many jobs available. Around a quarter of the state's population works for the government, with the rest making ends meet with various ranching and mining opportunities. People aren't exactly lining up for those kinds of jobs, so not only are locals moving out to greener pastures, but no one's coming into the state either. That's a bit of a trend for states located in the Great Plains. The Dakotas are 2 more states that people just don't want to move to. North Dakota was virtually untouched for much of America's early history. But when the railroad finally came to town, people had a reason to make the trip to the frigid area. Even so, the freezing weather has led to muted population growth so far. And once again, a shortage of adequate jobs rears its ugly head. North Dakota's a lot like Wyoming in that agriculture and mining is basically the only options. The lack of diversification is a serious problem, and it kind of explains why North Dakota is so empty. But what about its southern sister state? South Dakota has slightly better weather, not to mention better tax laws, and a much more diverse economy. Despite that, it has fewer residents than the city of Jacksonville, Florida. Combined, the 2 Dakotas have hardly 1.5 million people between them. That makes for a population density of about 11 per square mile, which is nearly twice as much as Delaware's 6 people per square mile, but it still leaves vast tracts of open land that no one lives in. Of course, if you want to talk about low population density, Alaska is the clear winner. While America's northern state has over 730,000 people, which is way more than Wyoming can manage, it's also absolutely massive. Its population is spread so thin that there's just 1.3 people per square mile, and around 40% of them live in Anchorage. The rest of the state is basically a barren wasteland, which makes sense, considering how isolated it is. This isolation also makes it a bit of a hub for crime, and Alaska's become notorious for its high number of serial killers. I mean, can you really blame people for wanting to stay away? To be fair, the fact that it's up north already works against it. Most states along the border with Canada have an unusually low population. Just take Montana, for example. Together with the Dakotas and Wyoming, Montana is part of 4 American states that comprise the Great Plains. Remember when I said that these plains are notoriously underpopulated? That holds true for Montana as well, although there's an additional problem here that you might not expect. You see, Montana's home prices are absurdly high, and its cities, if you can even call them that, are seriously lacking in urban amenities. When you factor in the freezing weather, it's no surprise that Montana's population is barely over 1 million. That's quite decent when you compare it to the states I've previously mentioned, but considering that this is the 4th largest state in the US we're talking about, that number should be way higher. As it currently stands, Montana's population density is about 7.1 people per square mile, putting it a close third after Wyoming. Now, if you want to look at things purely from a total population point of view, Vermont's 640,000 people is an almost impressively low figure. Again, we have a state bordering Canada struggling to maintain its population, but in Vermont's defense, it's not a particularly large state. In fact, its population density is at a relatively healthy 70 per square mile. So if you think about it, Vermont's not doing too badly. To top that off, it was the state that most people wanted to move to back in 2020, mostly due to its beauty, relatively mild weather, and the gem of a city that's Burlington. And hey, remember that this is Bernie Sanders' home state. That alone would make it a popular destination for people looking to move. If the trend keeps going, Vermont will continue to outperform its neighbors and potentially even crack 1 million residents before too long. The only thing that can get in its way is the rising cost of living, which is something that Rhode Island has always struggled with. The state has around the same population as Montana, or 1.1 million to be precise, but there just aren't many big cities to live in. Look, we live in a day and age when most people want to live in bustling metropolises. That's where all the great jobs are. That's where the culture is, so there's a constant influx of people in cities. Rhode Island's biggest city is Providence. And, does anyone even know what happens there? When's the last time you even heard about Providence in the news? Sure, it's one of the oldest inhabited areas in the country, but despite its multi-century head start, it failed to become a major metropolitan hub. Can you imagine trying to find a job in America's tiniest state? Although low job rates don't always lead to a state's population shrinking. Over in Delaware, the population increased by 1.4%, even though the job market couldn't be worse. So, is someone fudging the numbers? Not quite. Basically, the home state of Dark Brandon himself has some pretty decent beaches, and retirees are looking to settle down on these sandy shores. This just goes to show how misleading population increases can be. Just because the number went up doesn't mean the state is doing well. Honestly, an influx of retirees can be disastrous for the housing market and inflation because they come flush with cash, which can send home prices skyrocketing. Now, Delaware only has a population of barely 1 million people, so it's still pretty empty, all things considered. In a way, it's obvious that these states wouldn't have a ton of residents. But did you know that Nevada has a population density 20 times lower than that of Delaware? You heard that right. The state that has Las Vegas has one of the lowest population densities in the country, and that's because practically everyone lives in Sin City. For real, Nevada has a population of about 3 million, and over 2/3 of that lives in and around Vegas. I guess you also have Carson City if you think 50,000 people count, but that's pretty much it. Economic incentives definitely bring people to Vegas, but you have to understand, the state barely has access to water outside of this city. I guess that's what happens when you're smack dab in the middle of the Mojave. New Mexico is another state where people are concentrated in a few areas. It has a population density of around 17 per square mile, even though Albuquerque has nearly 1 million people in its metropolitan area, with a density about 170 times higher than the overall state. The entire state has a population of 2 million, which means that around half are living in the ABQ. If you were paying attention to what I said about Nevada, you'll have no trouble figuring out what's happening here. Yup, outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico has very little to offer, other than jobs at oil fields if you're into that. Oh, and did I mention that the federal government owns about 35% of the land? That doesn't leave much room for people to live on, which further explains why it's so empty. Idaho, with a population density of 20 per square mile, has a similar issue. A massive chunk of the state is covered by dense forests, and the United States Forest Service owns all of it. 38% to be exact, which happens to be the highest percentage of any state. The state's population is nearly 2 million strong, and when you consider the presence of the Rocky Mountains, you'll realize that's about as much as Idaho can handle. So from Idaho's population density of just 20 per square mile to Wyoming's inhabitants barely crossing 500,000, this was why nobody lives in these empty states.